All right, so now we're going to do a more complicated test, not just string.split, and see how we need to use mocking in order to make things work when we're using external kind of APIs or methods that are provided. One example of where this comes in handy is when you're doing any sort of like database adding and writes and things like that. We don't want to be relying on that external database infrastructure. We just want to see like, is the logic of a given function correct that we wrote in Python? I don't care how Postgres and SQL Alchemy is doing their own stuff. So let's see how we do that by building off of the code I wrote in our databases demo last class. So I'm in app.py here, and this function I had written basically at the end of the demo was for whenever a user joined, so basically like logging in, then they would emit an event called join and pass in their username that we could use in this function. And in this function, we were creating a new instance of the person class using models.person. If you remember, then this person class is basically defining the table schema in our database that we wrote to with like ID, username, and email as the columns. So when somebody joined and like kind of logged in my example app, then we would basically run through this code. First, we would create a new user instance of the class, set the username field equal to what was passed in the socket event, and then setting just the email based off of the username. So just taking the username and doing that at stuff.com. And then we have an instance of this person class. We would add it to our database session, commit it so it actually saves and writes. And then after that, we would then query this database to see what are all the people that we've added into this database now. So ideally, since we ran this code here, we should see the new user added into the list when we make that query right here. And then when I look through that list, I was only wanting to get the username from that person object and then return that back to the client. So this is what I want to test out here in this demo. The first thing that I want to do is I actually want to break out some of this logic into its own function. So if you remember, unit testing really works hand in hand with needing to do that modular design pattern where you break things out functionally into as many functions as needed. So I basically copy pasted all the code here that is like writing and adding to a database. I don't think that should be inside of the socket listener. That can be a helper function that I have underneath, or even better, in its own file. So I copy pasted out this logic here into a new function called add user. It takes in the username, which is kind of provided to us from our socket data. And then it's returning back this list of usernames, which we kind of calculated here. And that list is what we actually emit back to the client. So here we kind of just took out all that logic to get the data, and then the socket stuff we're leaving behind inside of the original function. So now I can remove this code since this helper function does it, and then just make a call to that code. So now I'm calling add user, passing in my username and getting the list back. Cool. So I have add user here. This is my module. If I wanted to even go further, a good practice would be to have a separate function for writing to the database and then a separate function for reading to the database. But for simplicity, I'm just going to show you both in one right now. Now let's move over to our test. So in the tests directory, I created a test directory actually. And then I created this new file, app.test.py, where I'm adding in a test case here for adding the user. So I just call it add user test case. That's my class that I've created. Now let's build this test out. So a lot of the kind of structure is the same as when we did our last string.split test. Some differences, I do need to add this here so that I can reference a file like my app.py file from a parent folder. And then I've set up my test params right here. So in my setup method, which is going to be run every time you do the test, I'm thinking, what is my input that I want to test out, and then the expected output. So the input of this function, the function takes in a username. So I could give any username. I'm thinking I'll just do num here. And then what's my actual expected output? So what is the list of usernames that is coming out of this function? Well, I know for sure that whatever the list originally was, I want num to be at the end of it. We're not using a real database in this case because we don't want to have to rely on that infrastructure. We just want to see the logic's okay. So I'm saying that, let's say that originally in the database, we just had one user called user1. So that's actually the initial username that I'm going to set here. And then what I would want is that my name num should be added on at the end. And that would mean that I've successfully written to my database here that we're going to be mocking. Okay, and then if you see my actual test cases here, similar to the last one, I'm looping through my cases. I'm going to call add user with my input to get the actual result. And then I'm going to also access my expected result, which I've defined here. And then I want to see, can I assert that these two arrays have the same length and that the two arrays have the same value for the second element, which I would want to be num. So that's the test here. Let's try running it. Let's see what happens. It's not going to work, but let's see. I'm going to do python app test.py. And yeah, so the error I'm getting here is key username num actually already exists. This is because I currently am writing to the real database that I created last class on Heroku. So in my testing, I've already had this value num in that remote database. So that's why, since it has to be unique, it won't show up here. But this is the exact point of why we don't want to be relying on an external service. I don't know what sort of data is going to be added into my database. That's kind of being remotely hosted. People are adding to it, let's say, through whatever app that you've built. So I don't want to need to actually access that database and rely on like what values are inside of it. Otherwise, I could get these sorts of unique key errors. That's why I want to mock it out and basically just create like a fake database in memory, just inside of this class, this test case class here, that I can just test the logic on after that. So let's do that then. Why don't we first actually set our initial value for the database? So if you remember, I was saying that I want to start the database out with, let's say, one user in it, just so I can make sure that my name that when I log in or when I join is being actually added on to that list. So to do that, I can basically create a new instance of a person object and then add that into, let's say, just whatever my database is. So I'm going to say self.initialDB mock is going to be equal to an empty list. And then let's create a person. So, oops, writing JavaScript. Initial person is going to be equal to, I'm going to access models. So models.person. And then give an instance. So I'm going to say the username is going to be initial username. And then the email is going to be, let's say, I'm just going to take the string that I've already given as my initial username and just add @stuff.com at the end. Okay. All right, so that's my initial person that I want to start the database out whenever I run the test. And I'm just going to add that here in this list. So now we know that this should show up as an expected key based on my logic. Now we want to just see, am I adding my new one in? So the next thing we need to do is we basically need to mock out my calls to the real database inside my add user function. So where all am I making some calls that are related to my external database? One is here, dbSession.add. That's allowing me to add something to this database session. And then commit, which is actually writing it officially to that Heroku database. And then the third one here is persons.query.all, which is reading that database and returning the rows. So these are 3 lines here that I'm going to need to mock out because I know that these are all external services. Another example would be if you make a call to an API, then you're accessing like Spotify's database or something. I don't want to know about what is actually in their database. I could just mock out a response and say, here's like an example response that I might expect with these songs, which is kind of like the fallback errors that you were doing in project 1. Okay, so how do we actually mock something out? Well, you're basically going to need to add some context statements in your Python. And if you don't know what that is, that's okay. You can kind of look that up later. So I have this helper that I've imported up here called patch. And patch is what's going to allow you to actually replace, let's say, a method like db.session.add with some just like dummy function that you've created that is going to do the similar sort of logic as you would expect. So I could do patch, and then I'm going to have to start with app because I am referring to it from my app file. So you may have to start with app because db is kind of a property or like, some sort of variable that's within app.py. So I'll do app.db.session.add. And this is the whole kind of call that I want to replace right here with my own sort of dummy function. And then I need to give it my dummy function. So this is something that I'm going to have to actually define now. I can define it here as a method. I could also define it outside, doesn't really matter. But let's say I define it in here and I'm going to say mocked db session add. So I'm just making this up, this name. It's going to take in the self like class properties do, or class methods. And then what do I want to do to actually add it? Basically, I have my mocked database itself, this list that I created. I just want to add to that list when we call something. So this is the actual argument that's called in when you say mock. So we could say username. This is like what's actually passed in right here, new user in this case. And then I would just want to do self.initial db mock, and then add.append username. So this would be similar to what is happening in like SQL Alchemy, and you're just mocking that out. All right. Now I can refer to that here. So I can say self.mocked, this thing right there, db session add, and this will now replace this call when we have this inside the context. So I'm going to move this one indentation so that we're within this with statement. Cool. Let's try running it. Let's see what happens. Okay. Assertion error 11 is not equal to 2. So this is taking us to line 38, where I'm trying to see the length of the real results and the length of the expected results. The reason for that is we're still kind of referring to our real database out there using models.person.query.all. So in that original database that I've been writing to, there are like 11 elements there. So that's why we're kind of referring to that still and not a fake version of our data. That's because we still haven't mocked these two functions right here. So let's go ahead and do that. So let's mock db.session or app.db.session.commit. And then we're going to need another function here, another method. So let's say I'm going to call that mocked db session commit. Now this doesn't actually take in any arguments, so I can just say self as the method. And this doesn't actually do anything in terms of our scope here. In this case, it's taking something from the database session and then writing it to the real Heroku database. But in our case, in our add, we've already added it to our list that we're just storing in memory here. So we don't need to actually do anything when we see commit. So that's okay. I'm just saying pass there. And we've added our second context now with app.db.session.commit. All right. Final thing we need to do is mock this query.all call. And this is what's going to get us back our fake data instead of calling our real database, which we don't really have any insight into and could change every time that we ran the test. So that's not a good way to be doing it. So now let's patch models.person.query. And you would think that we should do models.person.query.all in order to make this work, but for some reason we have to do just .query here and then add some code inside of there. So I'm going to say with this as mocked query. What this does is it basically lets me get the context or like the mocked function here, models.person.query, and refer to it as this variable that I'm calling mocked query inside of the with statement. So final thing I need to do is kind of add in that .all part of it. So I'm going to have my mocked query, but then I need to do dot, and let me just check the code to make sure I'm doing it right. So mocked query.all. So I'm saying I'm setting the method for mocked query, and that is going to be a new function that I then define. So let's define that now. And this is going to be called mocked person query all. Again, this doesn't actually take in any arguments, so I can just pass in self. And then I want to return something here. Now, what is my fake data that I've been storing? Well, my fake database I actually initialized here in the setup, and this is going to be called initial db mock. So I can just say self.initial db mock and return that. And that's the database that I would expect. Okay, so I'm going to set that now to my mocked method here. And there we go. So now all three of these lines, which are kind of dependent on external stuff, have been mocked by our internal test. The final thing to do is just run this and see what's going on. So I'm going to move this in to the right indentation. I am going to print the actual result as well as the expected result, as well as our initial db mock. And this is just going to allow me to explain how things are moving in this. Okay. So let's test this out. I'm going to go down to my terminal and let's run python app.py, app-test.py. I'm so used to app.py. Okay, cool. So the test is actually showing that it ran successfully. We have this okay right here. Let's just dive in and see what we printed out so I can explain what happened as well. So the first thing I printed was the initial db mock. And as expected, we're starting out with just the person object for user one. So this was the initial person that I set in my setup file. The next thing we're printing is the actual result. So this is basically what was returned by our call to add user. This would be the output that we would expect, or not expect, but that we actually got. And it's a list of usernames. So we're seeing user one and Numan, which is good because that's what we wanted to see. Numan was the input, and this should be added on to user one. And that's actually the last thing that we print when you see expected result right here. So the expected and the actual are the same, which is why this is passing here. And then one more thing just to note is that we can see here that the initial DB mock changed. We had just person user one at the beginning, and now we have person num1 as well. So here we know that the logic is correct in our add user. It is really simple. It's just kind of adding a new person object onto the DB. But now we're kind of automatically testing this in a good way.